So now's the chance to do what's right. Now's the chance to break with the old ways, to diminish the role of the standard forces in American politics, the money in American politics, and pay attention to what the American people want more than anything. And please appoint people who care about these issues, not their own careers, who are independent of these money influences. You do that kind of thing, that basic thing, you can change American politics, you can change America, you can change the world.
Welcome to a very special episode of Press the Button, as Michelle Dover sits down with Joe Cirincione for one final interview before he steps down as Ploughshares Fund president. And now, here for the last time are your hosts, Michelle Dover and Joe Cirincione.
Joe, for your last episode on the podcast and as Ploughshares Fund president, I am so thrilled to get to sit down with you to talk about the state of the world. I really want to hear from you where we're at, what are the drivers of U.S. policy around nuclear weapons, and the state of the field. What do we need to get where we want to go? Nuclear weapons have been in existence for 75 years, and you've been working to get rid of them for how many?
About 40 years. I came to Washington in 1981 to go to Georgetown Graduate School, and one of the reasons was the nuclear arms race. So I've been working either as an academic or as a professional staffer on Capitol Hill or as a director of projects and staffs in the NGO world for about 40 years now.
You know, we often talk about on this show that at their peak in the 1970s, all of the countries in the world had almost 70,000 nuclear weapons, and now we're down to about 13,000 today. We also talk about the risks they still pose and the greater risks that we're running at this point, whether because of strained relationships between countries or plans and programs to upgrade arsenals. What's the story you see? Where are we at?
Overall, I think the trends are positive historically, but that doesn't mean we still don't live in a very dangerous nuclear world. Our colleague, Tom Kalina, and our partner, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, just had a wonderful op-ed last week in the New York Times warning about this. You know, everybody sees the effect of climate change. Everybody sees the effect of the pandemic. Everybody sees the effect of a corrupt and dangerously incompetent administration. Now we're seeing the anger toward the systemic racism that this society has tolerated for far too long. But what you don't see is the danger from nuclear weapons. These things are hidden. They're buried in silos in the Great Plains of America. They're in submarines patrolling the depths of the Pacific and Atlantic oceans. They're in remote bomber bases in the Midwest or in the South, but they are there. They are there. And every single one of them is many times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One submarine alone carries thousands of Hiroshimas on it. Thousands. One submarine alone can destroy human civilization, right? And we have 14 of them, just by ourselves, plus the nuclear weapons are held by Russia, et cetera. So this is an extremely dangerous situation. We still do live under the nuclear sword of Damocles that John F. Kennedy warned us about, dangling by a slender thread. They could be cut at any moment by accident, miscalculation, or madness. And we see that in the current world. We don't necessarily connect it to the nuclear arsenals, but we should. So this is still there. This is one of the great existential threats to humanity, along with climate change, and now you'd have to say pandemics, but it gets the least attention. We've sort of let it go. We've thought the problem was solved, but it's not solved. We have come down from peaks, and this is why I'm optimistic. There are far fewer weapons in the world now than there used to be. We've cut stockpiles by about 85% over the last 30 years or so. There are fewer programs in countries. There are few countries that want these weapons. The majority of the world is non-nuclear. There are only 9 nuclear states. Everybody else does not have nuclear weapons, and they're fine with that. They're not scrambling. It's not like the 50s and 60s where they're scrambling to get them. And even in regions where there's been failures, South Asia, Northeast Asia, North Korea, India, Pakistan, who got nuclear weapons, during this last 20 years or so, even there, you don't see this contagion spreading to the neighboring states. South Korea is not racing for a bomb, or Japan, or Nepal, or Bhutan. That's not the way it is anymore. People do not see these weapons as necessary to their security, but those that still have them do, and they cling to them. But for the rest of the countries in the world, they're more in line with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty that passed the United Nations, that is now on its way to being ratified, probably later this year or early next, that says we should ban nuclear weapons the way we ban biological weapons and ban chemical weapons. We've got to get rid of these things. And they're right. And that's sort of the general mood of the world. It's also the general mood of the American public. Poll after poll shows that the American public supports the elimination of nuclear weapons in a verifiable and mutually balanced way. Nobody's talking about unilateral disarmament, but get rid of these weapons. And politicians who have championed these causes, we see popular support. It plays well with their basis. And interestingly enough, those who want a nuclear arms race do not get the kind of public support they used to get. Look, when I came to Washington, the mood here was the Reagan era. Reagan had been elected in part by campaigning against Jimmy Carter for what he called the window of opportunity, this myth perpetuated by a far-right group called the Committee on the Present Danger. I was just cleaning out my office. I still have the report from the Committee on the Present Danger. I still have my report from the High Frontier, this wacko group that convinced Reagan that we had to launch a space-based defensive system that could neutralize nuclear weapons. Crazy ideas. But they seized the president and they won popular support. They scared the public into thinking that they needed a strong man and they needed to spend more money on nuclear weapons. You don't hear that kind of rhetoric from politicians now because they know it doesn't play. It's not that they don't say it. It's just that it doesn't resonate. There's no crowds chanting, "We want more nukes." That just isn't where we are in the world anymore. So that gives me great optimism about where we can go with this. And as we'll discuss later, I see all the forces in society moving away from nuclear weapons. But that doesn't mean they're gone, because there are very, very strong forces hidden from the public still keeping this nuclear weapons complex alive and perpetuating the myth that these are essential to our security. That myth, that central myth, has not yet been broken.
Well, and that's what I wanted to get at. I mean, in some ways, this reminds me of those stories of like trying to lose the last 10 pounds. It's always the hardest for a variety of reasons. What will it take to lose the last 13,000 nuclear weapons? Okay,
so now we have to get into the politics of all this. So, we've talking on the other podcasts in depth about the situations in North Korea and the situation with Iran, the situation with launch on warning and why we need no first use, et cetera. So we won't go into the policies here. But let's talk about the thing that we don't talk enough about, which is the politics. Last week on the podcast, we did a wonderful interview with Steve Bannon. And this is his theme. His new book, The Imposters, is all about how the GOP gave up being a governing party and became a post-policy party. It no longer matters what the position is. It's whether that position will help them retain their grip on power. And that's where I think the nuclear debate is. That's for at least for one part of the GOP, the politics of this are to use this as a tool for staying in power, to posture tough on nuclear weapons as a way of maintaining their national security credentials, to focus on China as the new threat, as a way to have the enemy that they're running against, and they, with their strong man policies, don't lose the gender lens on this. I mean, the way these guys talk about it, the way they present themselves as the male hero is conscious, I think. And so you see them doing that. And in the Democratic Party, unfortunately, the Democrats are still stuck in the Clinton era, where they decided that the weakness of the Democratic Party was that they were seen as weak on defense, that they had had enough with McGovern and with Mondale and the anti-war movements and the anti-nuclear movements, and they had to show that they were just as tough on national security as the Republicans, and that's still where we are. So you see, the Democrats are afraid of national security. They're afraid to take this on. They don't have the courage of their own convictions. They know what we need to do. They're just afraid to do it. So you see it time after time where they will subordinate the correct policy for political positioning. So the Democrats have been infected by this disease that Steve Bannon talks about as well. The Democrats as well subordinate policy for political gain, and this is hurting our ability to decide the correct policy, to come up with the correct strategy.
How are you seeing that now?
Well, let's take what's happening this week while we're recording this. The House Armed Services Committee just reported a bill out that basically rubber stamps Trump's $740 billion Pentagon request, which includes $70 billion for nuclear weapons and related programs. The most we've spent on nuclear weapons in, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years? It's an enormous budget. And this is for systems that, in some cases, we just don't need. And in other cases, like the $20 million they want for missile defense and missile defeat programs, are systems that we know don't work. These systems, by and large, don't work. Not the short-range missile defense systems, like the improved Patriot and the Aegis system. That kind of works against short-range threats. But the motivation for missile defense is the long-range threat. And we know these things don't work. Just quick tangent. The ground-based interceptor. There's supposed to be a brand new, what they call kinetic kill vehicle. The Pentagon canceled that last year because it didn't work. So we have no new interceptor, right? So this missile defense system that's supposed to protect us, we know the 40 interceptors in the ground don't work. We know that there is no replacement for it that doesn't work, and we're still pouring money on it. You would never do this in any kind of rational defense policy, but you're doing it because of the politics, because Democrats are afraid to look weak on defense, afraid to do even oversight, even reports, even hearings. What's the last hearing that you can remember on nuclear weapons that took a critical look? What's the last investigation into the waste, fraud, and abuse in the missile defense program? They just don't do it. They're shirking their responsibility because they don't want to talk about it. They want to talk about these other things. I actually think they're missing an opportunity, and I see that changing. I see what happened to Eliot Engel. This is the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee that had this hawkish positions on national defense, including opposition to the Iran deal, including positions in favor of the disastrous invasion of Iraq. This was their pro-defense guy. He got clobbered in his primary election by an insurgent progressive who made this an issue, who said that his positions on this were out of step with the district, and he was right. Engel got beat 2-1. A sitting chairman got knocked off. I can't remember the last time that happened. That should be a warning, or more exactly, an alarm bell for the Democratic leadership that they're misplaced, that their policies to avoid defense or to stock up their campaigns, or if they should get state power again, if they should get the executive branch again, with sort of standard beltway defense consultants and former defense contractors, that's not the way America wants to go. That's certainly not the way the Democratic Party wants to go. So I see the domestic politics at this tipping point. Basically, the parties are still operating in this Cold War frame, both Republicans and Democrats, but the people are moving past that. And I think real change always comes from the bottom up, and I think that this bottom-up insurgency, the demands of the moment, are going to force eventually the politics on this to change as well. It's just not happening fast enough.
So what can we do to drive that change faster? I mean, you talk about the contractors and the money involved in this, which is its own driver of these programs outside of the two parties.
Yeah, right. So let's break this down. So, why do parties take the positions that they do on this? Well, one is there's genuine strategic differences and strategic analysis. I mean, there's some people who really think this is strategy A or strategy B is the better one, and they argue for it. Those strategists tend to overrate the impact and influence of their strategic thinking. And in the current era, I do believe that strategy plays less of a role, but it's the veneer on top of the overall struggle that's going on. The second factor is sort of careers. The people who are making these arguments, the people that are staffing these positions, they have grown up inside the Washington bubble, and they have spent their careers in congressional positions, executive branch positions, consultants for defense contractors, actually working at defense contractors. Look at our current Secretary of Defense, or lobbyist for Raytheon, who replaced the acting Secretary of Defense, who was a lobbyist for Boeing. I mean, look at this revolving door that goes on between Congress, the executive branch, and the contractor world, and maybe with a short stint in the NGO world. So you see that people's personal well-being, personal fortunes are geared to this, and people can get rich off of this. I mean, you can come to Washington as a grad student, and you could end up rich from working in this defense field. You can make a lot of money in this field as long as you're a pro-defense contractor, as long as you do what the contractors want. And that gets to the final variable, and it's one we don't talk enough about. It's the money. It's the money that matters. As the Beatles would say, give me money. I believe that the main driver in nuclear policy right now is not strategy, it's not political advantage, it's contracts. That the contractors are driving our policy. Elizabeth Warren said it. The 5 biggest defense contractors are determining U.S. military policy. I believe this is true. They're just so rich. There's so much money. They have profited. Their stock prices, with a couple of notable exceptions like Boeing, their stock prices have soared under Trump. They soared under Obama. These people have made tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. Half of the defense budget goes directly to contractors. So you're looking at $320 billion directly to contractors. You don't think that they're swarming all over Capitol Hill to make sure that money pipeline continues? They are. Our colleague John Carl Baker wrote a piece a few months ago where he pointed out that there are 727 paid lobbyists for the defense industry, and that the defense industry spent $128 million a year to lobby this. There's only 435 members of Congress. You have 727 lobbyists. So they're all over the place, and that doesn't even count the contracts. No member of Congress in chairing a committee feels obligated to say, I'm going to excuse myself from this decision because I've received contributions from the corporation that will be affected by this decision. No one feels that they should do that. Judges have to do that, right? When we have a board meeting and one of our board members represents an NGO that's getting a grant, they excuse themselves from the vote. A member of Congress doesn't do that. Why? Because it's seen as business as usual. So the fact that Jim Cooper, the chairman of the Strategic Subcommittee, the House Armed Services Committee, just passed a mark that just rubber stamped the Pentagon defense contractor requests and doesn't disclose that 3 of his top 5 campaign contributors are nuclear weapons contractors, tells you something's wrong with this system. There should be a warning label on C-SPAN hearings. Warning, this member of Congress received $200,000 from defense contractors last year. But there are no such things. It's invisible. It's like the nuclear weapons themselves. You just don't see it, but it is the driving force behind U.S. nuclear policy at this point. It's keeping the money flowing. It's keeping the contracts going. It's coming up with new plans for new weapons, for new missions, expanding the nuclear contracting field, not shrinking it.
But this is only the United States that we're talking about. How does this relate to the other 8 nuclear-armed countries?
Well, the one you really have to worry about is Russia. And they're the only one with an arsenal close to ours. The U.S. and Russia have about 93% of all the weapons in the world. And they are clinging to these weapons as the last vestige of great power status. This is a collapsing country, collapsing economy, collapsing demographics, no allies to speak of, unless you want to count Belarus. Nothing like what the Soviet Union enjoyed. But they pretend to still be a great power, and nukes are one of those great power elements. After that, you have the UK, China, and France, which have a couple hundred nuclear weapons each. I know for political reasons, this administration is focusing on China, 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 China. but it's got 1/20th the number of nuclear weapons as the United States or Russia have. So it is a problem. 300 nuclear weapons can still destroy the world, but it is not racing the way the U.S. and Russia are. And the U.K. and France are in a similar position. They're clinging to their nuclear weapons as that last vestige of empire, right? Why do Great Britain and France still have seats on the UN Security Council? Well, partially it's because they're nuclear powers. And after those countries, you do have to worry about India and Pakistan, which have about 150 nuclear weapons each. You do have to worry about Israel, which has about 100, and North Korea, which might have enough material for about 30. These are still powerful arsenals. One of these weapons could destroy a city. One. And so it's still too many. And conflicts and tensions are increasing around the world, in part because of the change in geopolitical relations. Countries are rising, others are falling, in part because of the pandemic and the economic crisis, which is increasing instability. So you have in South Asia right now 2 serious conflicts, one between India and China, where they are killing each other right now, and one between Pakistan and India, where they were killing each other just a couple of months ago. Either one of these could flare up into a conventional conflict that could quickly spiral into a nuclear exchange. So this is real. But the way that we can influence that, the way we can get at that, at least the nuclear dimension of it, is to be steadily doing what we had been doing until the Trump administration, decreasing the overall stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world, setting the course of international relations towards a non-nuclear world, where we were devaluing these weapons, devaluing their role in strategies, decreasing the portions of our defense budgets that went towards these weapons. When you do that, then you have the standing to try to convince India and Pakistan to freeze their arsenals at current levels. Then you have the standing to say to China and France and Great Britain, it's time to come into a broader strategic discussion. We, the U.S. and Russia, are going to cut our arsenals down to, say, 1,000 each. And then you, with several hundred each, you can join these conversations. Now you have a more equal playing field. You have greater incentives for those countries to do it, but we're moving in the opposite direction. You see what the U.S. administration is doing right now. They're trying to bully China, bait China, taunt China, as if it's some kind of Twitter war, that we can get China to the table if we just yell at them enough. It's absurd. It's a failed strategy. It's a failed policy. And hopefully in the next administration, we'll have this more a comprehensive view, the way Barack Obama did. He understood that disarmament and non-proliferation are 2 sides of the same coin. You have to be doing both of them at the same time in order for either one of them to succeed.
In listening to you, I'm really struck that for those of us who follow these issues or work on them, I really see nuclear weapons as unique from a technology standpoint, right? As you said, a single one can destroy a city. But as you discussed about the politics and the drivers behind why these arsenals are in the state that they're in, they don't look as special. And those in charge and those with power over them see them as just another piece of the political puzzle. And so as we think about how you can make change right now, you've listed the challenges with this administration, the makeup of the current U.S. Congress, but also the opportunities with the current mass movements. How do we need to change our thinking, our actions, or our organizing in order to make an impact?
Yeah, you're right. Nuclear weapons are not our ultimate security. They are our ultimate threat. And our policies have to be focused on reducing these weapons, getting rid of them as soon as possible, not increasing them, not coming up with new missions for them, new justifications, new contracts. So how does that fit into the current mass movement? Well, this is what gives me the most optimism. I have to tell you, what's going on in America right now is perhaps unprecedented since the revolution. I mean, I don't want to be over dramatic about this, but there are millions of Americans now involved in the political life of this country in a way that I have not seen in my lifetime. We've had mass movements before, civil rights movements, labor movements, women's suffrage movements, but we've rarely seen them sort of at this scale, at this sustained level, and happening at the same time. And while they are concentrated on different problems and different sets of policy solutions, controlling gun violence, controlling police violence, controlling the violence against women that has so many faces, stopping the violence against the environment, stopping global warming. While they have different goals, they all share the same. They need a fundamental change in government priorities and government spending. They need more international cooperation, not less. They need a change in our politics. They need more transparency. They're all up against entrenched financial interests. People make money off of fossil fuels. People make money off of guns. People make money off of keeping women down. People make money off of nuclear weapons. So you realize they've all got this unity. So what we have to do is forge a broad, united front of all these groups where they see that they all are facing the same obstacles. And they see that they all have the same interests in this fight. And some of that's already happening. So the nuclear movement, frankly, has stood a little apart from this. And that's because, if you don't mind me getting into this, our structures were formed in the Cold War. The Council for a Livable World, the Arms Control Association, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Federation of American Scientists, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. These were all born during the Cold War. Some of them go back to the Manhattan Project. And they have not adapted yet. And not just to the post-Cold War world. I mean, there have been some changes. For example, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists sets its doomsday clock to include concerns about nuclear weapons and climate change and cyber threats. So they understand the threats that we face, but they haven't adopted their organizational form. So as a result, we have scores of small organizations fighting skirmishes across a broad battle space. And they are just too small to win these fights. Normally. And when they do, it's a minor miracle. I mean, the fact that we won the Iran deal, that was a lot of factors involved there, including that we were backing an administration policy. It was a solid deal, the best non-proliferation agreement I've ever seen in my life. And we had strong allied support. But this was a political fight in the United States, and the NGOs weighed in on that fight at a crucial moment and tipped the scales. I am convinced, partially because of what former administration officials have told me, that our work on that, we as Ploughshares, we as NGOs, our work on that prevented a new war with Iran. I believe that. It's one of the things I'm proudest of is my personal career is stopping that war. And I vowed to do that because I hadn't stopped the Iraq war. As an analyst at the Carnegie Endowment, I knew that there was no reason to invade Iraq. I knew that the inspections were working. I knew that Saddam Hussein was not rushing to build a nuclear weapon. I knew that was false, but we couldn't, as NGOs, stop that war. We stopped the Iran war. But in order to repeat that kind of success, we're going to have to do two things. One is to forge the united front that I just talked about. Take these issues, take these budget issues, and bring them, into the climate movement, into the Green New Deal. You want money for a Green New Deal? Well, I got a bloated nuclear budget that can give you some of that money. You want to defend Medicare for all or just defend Medicare? We've got a $740 billion budget that should go down to around 300, and we can transfer those funds over to social needs. But in order to do that, even, you got to bring something to the table. And right now, the groups are just too small to have much to offer these groups. So they've got to unite. I think we're in a time that requires NGO mergers and consolidations, where these groups have got to understand we cannot survive in the form that they're currently in. The money's not going to be there. The paltry foundation money that flows to the NGO field, about $40 million, pales in comparison to the $1.2 billion that foundations give to climate change organizations. Even that $40 million may not be there as the foundations are hammered by these other new emerging demands: pandemic, economic collapse, social justice. So they've got to unite. And if they unite, they will be stronger for it. They will also actually start to have clout. And they've got to understand the politics of this. J Street's a great example of an organization that understands the politics and the policy and merges them together and has a wing of the organization devoted just to rewarding and punishing politicians who either, have the right policies or actively, championing the wrong policies. That's the kind of thing that I see is the future for what you might call the arms control, the disarmament, the national security community, the people, the advocates, the people who want real change, not the think tanks that are getting paid by defense contractors and government contracts to just spit out variations of status quo policies. No, I mean the people who want fundamental change. They've got to unite. And if they do, I think they can have an influence far greater than what we're seeing now.
So as you move into a new headspace where you have lots of time to think and write and look at the big picture, are you optimistic?
I am optimistic. The pace of change is increasing. The challenges are daunting. And they're hammering our country, but they're also hammering the old ways of doing business. They're exposing things that we needed exposed. Look at what people are saying about Trump right now, that his game isn't working anymore. Well, his game worked. That con game worked. He got elected president. He kept power. He was able to push down every single progressive, strike that, every single human issue. Every issue that is actually helping people, that is improving the world, has gotten hammered under this administration. Climate, environment, race relations, gender issues, labor rights, everything across the board has been pushed back, including nuclear policy. We're getting hammered on nuclear policy, but that's changing. It's like, the tide has come in and it is eroding his foundations. You can see it happening. Him collapsing, the GOP political model collapsing, insurgents rising. The middle of the Democratic Party is now much further over to the progressive side than it's ever been, right? So even the conservatives in the Democratic Party are now much more moderate than they ever were, and much more supportive of these kinds of movements. And I see that happening. I see the people. I got to tell you, this is a little psychoanalytical, egocentric, but I got radicalized in the 60s and 70s. I was just a student at Boston College going about my business, psych major. I wanted to go working with kids, troubled kids at the time. And then Richard Nixon illegally invaded Cambodia. And then the National Guard shot down innocent students at Kent State and then at Jackson State. And I decided I was going to devote my life to changing that. My first slideshow that I gave as a senior in college to students streaming by to go to lunch was about what a sortie on a South Vietnamese village looks like. What is that plane? What are they dropping? What are the effects of those bombs? What are as we would now say, the humanitarian consequences of that strike? Oh, and by the way, Raytheon makes those cluster bombs and they're right up the street and we're having a demonstration on Saturday. You should come. I started doing that when I was 19, and I've never stopped, one form or another. And I see exactly that happening to a brand new generation. Thank you, Generation Z. The millennials have been doing a great job, and guess what? Reinforcements are on the way. Gen Z is coming, and they are pissed because we have saddled them with disaster on top of disaster, and they don't want it. They want to change it now. And they're organizing, and they're being radicalized. So am I encouraged? Yeah. I am encouraged. I don't think the world is going to be the same after this pandemic, after this economic collapse, after the 4 years of a disastrous, incompetent, malevolent, narcissistic presidency and his enablers. I think when that is trashed, when that goes down, I think the Republican Party is going to go through years of reconstruction. And that allows the next president to have enormous policy space. You can do so much. So now's the chance to do what's right. Now's the chance to break with the old ways, to diminish the role of the standard forces in American politics, the money in American politics, and pay attention to what the American people want more than anything. And please appoint people who care about these issues, not their own careers, who are independent of these money influences, require that people disclose who's been paying them all these years, get them to promise not to go to work for the contractors who will be influenced by the policies they're being asked to implement on behalf of the people of the United States. You do that kind of thing, that basic thing, you can change American politics, you can change America, you can change the world.
Joe, thank you for spending the past 30 minutes and 40 years of your expertise with us. And thank you for everything you've done here at Ploughshares and in the field. And I am so excited to welcome you back onto the podcast as Joe Cirincione, expert and influencer.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And we should tell our audience that we're recording this live in person for the first time since the pandemic hit. We're in the conference room of the Ploughshares Fund in our glass enclosed headquarters in Washington, D.C., socially distant.
Very far apart.
We're about what, 20 feet, 30 feet apart?
At least.
At either ends of our giant conference table in our lovely conference room. So it's been a pleasure talking with you about this. I'm going to miss you. I'm going to miss the great staff here at Ploughshares, but I know we're going to stay in touch. We're in the struggle, and you are the future. And it's been a pleasure to get the chance to work with you over these last few years. Thank you for everything you've done. And thank you to all the listeners here, those people who are still listening at the very end of this long podcast. I want to thank you for giving us your attention, for helping us spread the word. I appreciate your letters, your questions that you forced me to answer every week. I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.